Video review, Lessons for Ukraine from the Vietnam War. This is a brief review of a documentary, The Fog of War, from 2003, which is about the late Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense from 1961 to 1968 during the Vietnam War, with the President of the U.S. talking about Armageddon and the U.S. now deeply involved in a hot proxy war with Russia, the other major nuclear power in the world. It might be useful to take a look at the Vietnam War for any lessons related to Ukraine. So I'm mostly just going to read this with some additional comments here. The Fog of War is a 2003 video documentary on the career of former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, 1916 to 2009, primarily focusing on the Vietnam War, in which 58,220 Americans and many, many more Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians perished. The war had a reported cost of $168 billion in 1960 dollars, which in 2011 would be $950 billion, probably be at least $1.5 to $2 trillion today. So comparable to what was spent on Afghanistan, for example, or probably even possibly Iraq. McNamara was Secretary of Defense under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson from 61 to 68. He has been and was widely criticized for his leadership of the war effort. The documentary, The Fog of War, is often presented as a mea culpa by McNamara and as maybe lessons learned. I didn't really find much in the way of lessons that I could take away from it. The documentary is essentially an interview with McNamara, who was 87 at the time, interspersed with historical news footage that sometimes contradicts McNamara's often opaque, one might say foggy, answers. In many respects, it seems like a non-apology apology, in which McNamara makes hazy statements that in fact avoid responsibility, passing the buck repeatedly to his former boss, Curtis LeMay, President Johnson, unnamed subordinates, for the decision to use the Agent Orange herbicide in Vietnam, for example, and others, while sounding deeply but vaguely concerned about his fellow man. It's actually structured as a self-help video for future generations with 11 lessons from McNamara. So there are actually little slides that come up with these little aphorisms, these little slogans every few minutes. These are all the sort of general, mostly feel-good platitudes common in self-help materials. So the first one is empathize with your enemies, a touchy-feely variant of the old standby, know your enemies. If you pay close attention, at no point does McNamara say something like, I made decision X. In retrospect, it was a bad decision and I regret it. In discussing the controversy over Agent Orange, he says some people think the chemical was dangerous, which leaves open the possibility that it wasn't dangerous, implies someone else made the decision to use it, says he can't recall who made the decision, and expresses vague concern, not really regret, that it was used during his tenure as Secretary of Defense. In talking about Agent Orange, he doesn't discuss the taboo on the use of chemical weapons in warfare that grew out of their use in World War I, a taboo that even Nazi Germany, which had developed powerful nerve gases far deadlier than the mustard gas and chlorine used in World War I, but the Nazis actually did not use these weapons in World War II. They didn't put them on the V-2 rockets. They never used them in warfare. It's true they gassed people in camps, but as far as open warfare, they didn't go there. Even though, of course, Agent Orange is not quite at the level of nerve gas, it is a chemical weapon. And surely there should have been a cabinet-level review with the President and Secretary of Defense, McNamara, involved of any decision to use a chemical weapon. Does he not remember that? It would have been, one thinks, a major decision. I felt that there was a lot of good cop, bad cop maneuvering and in the documentary, and as I'll discuss a bit, the way liberal Democrats in particular kind of position the Vietnam War, their handling of the second war with Iraq, and other wars going up to and including Ukraine. So I'm going to read from Wikipedia just to remind people. Good cop, bad cop is a psychological tactic used in negotiation and interrogation in which a team of two people take opposing approaches interrogating their subject. One interrogator adopts a hostile or accusatory demeanor, emphasizing threats of punishment, while the other adopts a more sympathetic demeanor, emphasizing reward in order to convince the subject to cooperate. The bad cop takes an aggressive, negative stance towards the subject, making blatant accusations, derogatory comments, threats, and in general creating antipathy with the subject. This sets the stage for the good cop to act sympathetically, appearing supportive and understanding, and in general showing sympathy for the subject. The good cop defends the subject from the bad cop. The subject may feel able to cooperate with the good cop, either out of trust or out of fear of the bad cop, and then may seek protection by the good cop and provide the information the interrogators are seeking. The order can also be reversed. When performed in this manner, the good cop will try to gain a subject's trust. If that fails, the bad cop will intimidate the subject to make them crack under pressure. Now, it doesn't quite say it here, but the idea, the folk tradition, is that this procedure can often get the person who's being interrogated or get a plea deal in some cases, or that kind of thing, get them to agree to something they wouldn't otherwise agree to. If you only had the good cop talking to them, they just kind of shrug it off and not agree to the terms, for example. If the bad cop was there, if they'd hunker down, they say, I'm not going to get pushed around by the bad cop. If you have both, they tend to form a bond with the good cop and will often agree to something that if the pair wasn't there, they wouldn't agree to. Now, I don't know of any specific scientific studies or proof that this is what happens, but given the popularity of this technique, it seems likely that it does actually work that way. So in many respects, McNamara's interview and the documentary The Fog of War reflect what seems to be the modern Liberal Democrat Party line on the Vietnam War, and the more recent Iraq War too, and maybe other wars as well. Something like, the Vietnam War was a mistake. Kennedy and Johnson meant well. And if Kennedy had lived, it would have worked out so much better. Nixon didn't care. JFK and LBJ were browbeaten and misinformed into the debacle by hardline and often dishonest military and CIA leaders, such as Air Force General Curtis LeMay, whom McNamara paints as an ogre, CIA Director Allen Dulles, General William Westmoreland, failed Republican 1964 presidential candidate Barry Goldwater, and others. Once Nixon became president, the naive, ineffective, but much smarter and more caring Democrats woke up and abandoned the war. So in a sense, the Democrats are the good cop, and the right wing, the military, the Republicans are the bad cop. Well, that's very evident in 1964. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson ran as a peace candidate against the crazed maniac, war Republican, war hawk, Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. This is the way the election was run and how Goldwater was positioned. He was presented as a war-mongering nutcase. He apparently had a nervous breakdown at one point, things like that. So he was painted as this maniac as opposed to the stable, sane Johnson and, of course, McNamara and his staff. The documentary has a brief clip of Goldwater stating bluntly that the U.S. is in a war with Vietnam, and the administration is lying to the public, which indeed seems to have been true. Goldwater had a pretty blunt demeanor. So, in August of 1964, only 3 months before the presidential election, there was an alleged series of actually 2 incidents in the Gulf of Tonkin near Vietnam where the North Vietnamese allegedly attacked the U.S. fleet there, the USS Maddox and another ship. These attacks seem to have killed or injured no one and caused either no or minimal damage. There's debate to this day whether they occurred. McNamara discusses the attacks, assuring the viewers that yes, in retrospect, the attack on August 2nd occurred, but the second attack on August 4th was apparently a mistake by somebody, not him, obviously. Usually the term attack brings up thoughts of events like September 11, 2001, the attacks that killed almost 3,000 Americans, or Pearl Harbor, the official death toll for the attack was 2,403 in 1941. Despite the ephemeral nature of the supposed attacks, President Johnson seized upon them and gave a speech to the U.S. population. This is on August 4th, shortly after the alleged second attack, seeming to claim the U.S. was bombing North Vietnam as he was speaking, which would require the planes to be airborne from their base in the Pacific, thousands of miles away, before the alleged second attack. Not surprisingly, Barry Goldwater pointed out the timing problem and was ridiculed. I don't know if they called him a conspiracy theorist, but they would have done that today. Goldwater would give several speeches during the election campaign, questioning the incidents and suggesting a cover-up. At the time, this was, of course, ridiculed. In the fog of war, McNamara's vague assertions about the incidents and audio tapes played by the documentary suggest Johnson and McNamara may have been misled by either incompetent or willfully deceptive military officers, who in these tapes sound rather unsure of their own claims, not very good liars. Since 1964, tapes have been released indicating Johnson and McNamara privately had doubts about the incidents. Despite those doubts, they didn't delay or moderate the immediate statements to the public or delay the reported counterattack, the bombing. Of course, the documentary goes nowhere near this, and McNamara doesn't point this out. With no casualties, the President and Secretary of Defense could easily have released a reassuring statement through the presidential spokesman indicating there had been a possible minor incident with no casualties, and the U.S. was investigating to determine what actually happened before responding. It could, of course, included some stern language for North Vietnam that if this should be followed up with casualties, with more attacks, there would be severe repercussions. Just to point this out. This, of course, would be the more reasonable response, which somehow didn't happen. The highly publicized attacks with no casualties increased fears of war during the election campaign and seems to have helped Johnson's campaign against the right-wing hawk Goldwater. Would you rather have sane and stable Johnson at the helm or this maniac? That didn't turn out to be so clear-cut. Johnson was the good cop and Goldwater the bad cop, whether by design or accident. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution giving the administration a carte blanche for war in Vietnam, although there was no formal declaration of war, the U.S. has not declared war since World War II, was passed on August 10th, 1964, based on these ephemeral attacks with strong bipartisan support, not unlike the recent resolution to support Ukraine. McNamara also seems to use the good cop, bad cop routine in his discussion of the Cuban Missile Crisis, with his former boss, Air Force General Curtis LeMay, as the crazed bad cop warmonger planning World War III. By comparison, JFK and McNamara seem reasonable. We are led to think, thank God Curtis LeMay was not in charge. There is no discussion of the convenient timing of the crisis, which boosted JFK's approval ratings dramatically only weeks before the November 1962 midterm elections, creating panic, creating a rally around the president effect, and yet JFK could present himself to his liberal audience, to the left wing, as, I'm being pressured by these maniacs like Curtis LeMay. Vote for me or you'll get them. Fog of war or smokescreen. Both McNamara's answers on camera and the documentary emphasize McNamara's brilliance. A top student before attending Berkeley, UC Berkeley, in California. An Irish kid atypically outcompeting smart Jewish, Chinese, and Japanese students at the Piedmont High School in Piedmont, California. A top student at Berkeley, attending Harvard Business School. A key aide to Curtis LeMay during World War II. And whiz kid at Ford before being tapped as Secretary of Defense by JFK. Yet this self-described genius, he probably was a genius, repeatedly passes the buck by portraying himself and his boss, tough Texas politician Lyndon Johnson, as naive simpletons repeatedly hoodwinked and even intimidated by subordinates. Who, us? We were only in charge. To me, the Fog of War's actual 11 self-help platitudes, those little slides they show, are of little practical value in the modern crisis. There is a sobering lesson, although it's not a new one. Governments, including specifically highly educated, intellectual liberal Democrats who preach peace and brotherly love, frequently lie, blatantly, and on serious matters such as war and peace, sometimes just to win the next election, no matter the subsequent cost to the nation or the world. Super smart officials like Robert McNamara lie and are often excellent liars and master of double talk. Indeed, I think you can see a lot of this very evident in McNamara's performance in the documentary. He's really good at sounding concern, and yet all through it he avoids any direct responsibility for anything. And people like McNamara get away with it too. McNamara was rewarded with a Presidential Medal of Freedom from Lyndon Johnson and a cushy, highly paid job as president of the World Bank from 1968 to 1981. This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email and on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising beholden, big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical software is developing algorithms and software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and increasing the predictive power of the results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page, https://www.patreon.com/mathsoft, or scanning the QR code in the lower right corner.